There is a particular kind of silence that exists in places where something once stood, but no longer does. It is not emptiness. It feels more like absence with weight, as if the ground itself remembers what has been taken away. Archaeologists know this silence well. It settles between layers of earth, between fallen walls and buried foundations, in the pause before a discovery is named. And it is within this silence that the question quietly begins to form. What if the first kings of humanity did not invent their authority at all? What if, instead, they arrived to find power already waiting for them, structured, measured, and defined long before their names were ever spoken? In the ruins of southern Mesopotamia, beneath dry plains once crossed by rivers that no longer follow their ancient courses, clay tablets lie pressed flat by time. They are not poetic. They do not tell heroic origin stories or celebrate human ingenuity. They read like records, lists, accounts, the kind of writing produced by a civilization that believed order already existed, and that its role was simply to maintain it. The earliest rulers recorded in these texts never claimed to create the world they governed. They did not boast of inventing law, calendar, or city. Instead, they described something far stranger. They spoke as though rulership itself had a prior history, one that did not begin with humanity. In these records, kingship is not born, it descends. This single idea, stated without emphasis or explanation, destabilizes everything modern narratives assume about beginnings. Because beginnings, as we imagine them, are supposed to be loud. They are meant to erupt with invention, struggle, and trial. We expect to see rough edges, failed experiments, gradual improvement. We expect childhood. But the earliest memory preserved in these tablets suggests something else entirely. It suggests succession. Imagine standing in a city that believes it is not the first of its kind. Its streets follow paths that feel older than the bricks beneath your feet. Its temples rise on platforms built atop the ruins of structures long collapsed. Each new layer carefully aligned with the last, as if deviation itself were a kind of error. Nothing here claims originality. Everything points backward. The rulers who governed such cities did not see themselves as founders. They saw themselves as inheritors. This is an unsettling perspective, because inheritance implies loss. It implies that something existed before, something whole enough to be passed on, yet distant enough that it can no longer be fully understood. An inheritance also implies responsibility, not to innovate freely, but to preserve what was given. The earliest written histories of humanity do not open with the triumph of human thought. They open with a ledger, names, cities, durations, and then a sentence that changes the entire frame through which history is usually read. Kingship was lowered from heaven. The words are simple, administrative. They are not surrounded by mythic imagery or divine spectacle. There is no description of fire, thunder, or celestial descent. The phrase is presented as a statement of fact, as though it were obvious, unquestioned, and already known by those who read it. Kingship existed somewhere else before it existed here. This is not the language of imagination inventing authority. It is the language of bureaucracy documenting a transfer. And that is where the quiet unease begins to grow. Because if authority was transferred, then it must have been held by someone before. And if it was held before, then the earliest human rulers were not creators of civilization, but caretakers of a system they did not design. Throughout the ancient world, power is usually justified through conquest, lineage, or divine favor. But here, something different is implied. Authority is treated as an office, not an achievement. It does not belong to the individual. It belongs to the structure. This way of thinking shapes everything that follows. When laws are written, they are framed as restorations, not inventions. When cities are built, they are rebuilt according to older patterns. When knowledge is recorded, scribes copy texts they describe as ancient even in their own time. Innovation is not celebrated. Fidelity is difficult. From a modern perspective, to fully inhabit this mindset, we are conditioned to think of history as an upward line progress accumulating through experimentation and discovery. But these early records describe something closer to a descent, followed by recovery. A world once ordered more completely, then disrupted, then partially restored. The sense of loss is subtle, but persistent. It appears in the way kings describe their greatest achievements, not as acts of genius, but as acts of remembrance. It appears in the way cities are laid out, repeating the same sacred geometry generation after generation. It appears in the anxiety of scribes who warn future readers not to alter the text, even when its meaning has become unclear. They are not confident authors. They are careful archivists. And beneath all of it is the unspoken assumption that humanity arrived late. This is not stated outright. It does not need to be. The entire system of thought is built around it. Humans govern, yes, but only after something else withdrew. Humans maintain order, but only because that order was already defined. Humans remember, but they do not fully understand what they remember. The throne, in this telling, is not built by human hands. It is discovered. And once discovered, it cannot be reshaped at will. It must be preserved. This idea does not ask to be believed in the modern sense. It does not present itself as proof or revelation. It simply exists, embedded in the oldest layers of recorded memory, waiting to be noticed. The tablets do not argue. They do not persuade. They record. And perhaps that is what makes them so difficult to dismiss, because they do not sound like people inventing a myth to elevate themselves. They sound like people trying to remain faithful to something they believe is older than they are. If this is where history begins, not with invention, but with inheritance, then the familiar story of civilization subtly shifts. Progress becomes restoration. Discovery becomes remembrance. And humanity's first role is not mastery, but stewardship. The silence beneath the ruins grows heavier with that realization. Because if the world was already ordered once before, then the question is not how civilization began. The question is what ended it. If the first section leaves us standing before an empty throne, the second begins with the moment that throne is described, quietly, clinically, without ceremony. Not in a myth sung aloud, but in a list pressed into clay. A document that does not ask to be believed, because it does not explain itself. It simply records. The Sumerian king list is not a story in the way we understand stories. It has no arc, no moral tension, no climax. It is a sequence. City follows city. Name follows name. Reign follows reign. And yet, embedded within this structure is one of the most unsettling statements ever preserved by human hands. Kingship descended from heaven. The phrase appears at the very beginning, before any human ruler is named, before any city is praised. It is treated as a premise, not a conclusion. The scribe does not pause to clarify what heaven means, nor does he justify why kingship should originate there. He assumes the reader already understands. And then, immediately, the text does something even stranger. It assigns that descended kingship to a specific place. A city, Eridu, not a symbol. Not a realm of gods. A physical location that can be excavated, measured, and mapped. Kingship does not drift abstractly into humanity. It lands. This is not the language of metaphor. Metaphors do not need coordinates. The first ruler named is Alulam, and his reign is recorded as lasting tens of thousands of years. The number is written with the same care used to record grain inventories and livestock counts. No embellishment, no explanation, just a duration so vast it resists assimilation into ordinary human time. And then another name, another city, another reign measured not in decades, but in epochs. It is tempting to assume exaggeration. Modern readers often do. But the text itself offers no indication that exaggeration is taking place. There is no shift in tone, no poetic flourish. The scribes who copied these lists treated these reigns with the same seriousness as later verifiable kings whose lives fell within normal human limits. The list does not mythologize, it standardizes. That is what makes it so difficult to categorize. Creation myths usually explain, they dramatize, they justify the present by inventing a past that serves a narrative purpose. But this document does none of that. It does not tell us why kingship descended. It does not describe how it happened. It simply states that it did. And then it proceeds as though this fact requires no defense. What follows is a succession of rulers whose reigns stretch across spans of time that feel incompatible with human biology. Yet the text does not treat them as gods. It calls them kings. It assigns them cities. It places them within an administrative framework. The implication is subtle but profound. Whatever these early rulers were, they occupied the same office later held by humans. Kingship did not change. The nature of those who held it did. This distinction matters because it suggests continuity of governance across a discontinuity of beings. Authority in this worldview is not generated by human society, it precedes it. And then, abruptly, the list introduces a dividing line. A single sentence, written with the same unemotional precision as everything else. Then the flood swept over. No description, no drama, no divine anger, just a statement marking transition. Everything before this sentence belongs to one mode of existence. Everything after belongs to another. After the flood, the list resumes. Kingship appears again. It is lowered from heaven once more, but something is different. The reigns are shorter, still long by modern standards, but no longer impossibly vast. The numbers begin to shrink, gradually at first, then steadily, until they fall within spans that resemble human lifetimes. The text does not explain this change. It does not comment on it. But the pattern is unmistakable. Something fundamental has shifted. If the pre-flood section describes an age of extended rule, the post-flood section describes a world adjusting to limitation. Mortality reasserts itself. Authority remains, but its holders are no longer the same. And this is where the administrative tone becomes especially revealing. The list does not mourn the loss of the earlier rulers. It does not celebrate the arrival of human ones. It simply records succession. From this perspective, humanity does not overthrow its predecessors. It inherits from them. The kings who follow do not claim divine origin. They claim legitimacy through continuity. They rule because kingship has returned, not because they have seized it. Their authority is derivative, not absolute. This framework reshapes how power is understood. The king is not the source of order. He is its steward. His role is to maintain a system whose origin lies beyond his reach. And this understanding echoes far beyond this single document. It shapes how laws are written, how temples are rebuilt, how calendars are maintained. Everything important points backward. The scribes who preserved the king list across centuries did not treat the early sections as embarrassing relics to be corrected. They copied them faithfully, even when their meaning had grown obscure. They did not compress the reigns. They did not reinterpret the language, they preserved, because to alter the record would be to disrupt continuity. This is not how myths behave. Myths evolve to suit the needs of the present. This behaves like a constitution whose earliest clauses refer to a time before humans held office. The idea is not presented as extraordinary. That is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. There is no sense of wonder in the text, no hint that the scribes found this strange. For them, it was simply the way things were. Kingship existed. It descended. It was held. It was interrupted. It returned. And humanity entered the story not as an origin point, but as a chapter. If this document is taken seriously on its own terms, not as metaphor, not as fantasy, but as memory, then history begins, not with creation, but with succession, not with invention, but with resumption. And the flood, placed so calmly at the center of the list, becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a transfer, a moment when the structure of governance remained, but its custodians changed. The throne did not vanish. It waited. If the first section leaves us standing before an empty throne, the second begins with the moment that throne is described, quietly, clinically, without ceremony. Not in a myth sung aloud, but in a list pressed into clay. A document that does not ask to be believed, because it does not explain itself. It simply records. The Sumerian king list is not a story in the way we understand stories. It has no arc, no moral tension, no climax. It is a sequence. City follows city, name follows name, reign follows reign. And yet, embedded within this structure is one of the most unsettling statements ever preserved by human hands. Kingship descended from heaven. The phrase appears at the very beginning, before any human ruler is named, before any city is praised. It is treated as a premise, not a conclusion. The scribe does not pause to clarify what heaven means, nor does he justify why kingship should originate there. He assumes the reader already understands. And then, immediately, the text does something even stranger. It assigns that descended kingship to a specific place. A city, Eridu, not a symbol, not a realm of gods. A physical location that can be excavated, measured, and mapped. Kingship does not drift abstractly into humanity. It lands. This is not the language of metaphor. Metaphors do not need coordinates. The first ruler named is Alulam, and his reign is recorded as lasting tens of thousands of years. The number is written with the same care used to record grain inventories and livestock counts. No embellishment, no explanation. Just a duration so vast it resists assimilation into ordinary human time. And then another name, another city, another reign measured not in decades, but in epochs. It is tempting to assume exaggeration. Modern readers often do. But the text itself offers no indication that exaggeration is taking place. There is no shift in tone, no poetic flourish. The scribes who copied these lists treated these reigns with the same seriousness as later, verifiable kings whose lives fell within normal human limits. The list does not mythologize, that is what makes it so difficult to categorize. Creation myths usually explain, they dramatize, they justify the present by inventing a past that serves a narrative purpose. But this document does none of that. It does not tell us why kingship descended. It does not describe how it happened. It simply states that it did. And then it proceeds as though this fact requires no defense. What follows is a succession of rulers whose reigns stretch across spans of time that feel incompatible with human biology. Yet the text does not treat them as gods. It calls them kings. It assigns them cities. It places them within an administrative framework. The implication is subtle, but profound. Whatever these early rulers were, they occupied the same office later held by humans. Kingship did not change. The nature of those who held it did. This distinction matters, because it suggests continuity of governance across a discontinuity of beings. Authority, in this worldview, is not generated by human society. It precedes it. And then, abruptly, the list introduces a dividing line. A single sentence, written with the same unemotional precision as everything else. Then the flood swept over. No description, no drama, no divine anger. Just a statement marking transition. Everything before this sentence belongs to one mode of existence. Everything after belongs to another. After the flood, the list resumes. Kingship appears again. It is lowered from heaven once more, but something is different. The reigns are shorter, still long by modern standards, but no longer impossibly vast. The numbers begin to shrink. Gradually at first, then steadily, until they fall within spans that resemble human lifetimes. The text does not explain this change. It does not comment on it, but the pattern is unmistakable. Something fundamental has shifted. If the pre-flood section describes an age of extended rule, the post-flood section describes a world adjusting to limitation. Mortality reasserts itself. Authority remains, but its holders are no longer the same. And this is where the administrative tone becomes especially revealing. The list does not mourn the loss of the earlier rulers. It does not celebrate the arrival of human ones. It simply records succession. From this perspective, humanity does not overthrow its predecessors. It inherits from them. The kings who follow do not claim divine origin. They claim legitimacy through continuity. They rule because kingship has returned, not because they have seized it. Their authority is derivative, not absolute. This framework reshapes how power is understood. The king is not the source of order. He is its steward. His role is to maintain a system whose origin lies beyond his reach. And this understanding echoes far beyond this single document. It shapes how laws are written, how temples are rebuilt, how calendars are maintained. Everything important points backward. The scribes who preserved the king list across centuries did not treat the early sections as embarrassing relics to be corrected. They copied them faithfully, even when their meaning had grown obscure. They did not compress the reigns. They did not reinterpret the language. They preserved, because to alter the record would be to disrupt continuity. This is not how myths behave. Myths evolve to suit the needs of the present. This behaves like a constitution. A constitution whose earliest clauses refer to a time before humans held office. The idea is not presented as extraordinary. That is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. There is no sense of wonder in the text, no hint that the scribes found this strange. For them, it was simply the way things were. Kingship existed. It descended. It was held. It was interrupted. It returned. And humanity entered the story not as an origin point, but as a chapter. If this document is taken seriously on its own terms, not as metaphor, not as fantasy, but as memory, then history begins, not with creation, but with succession, not with invention, but with resumption. And the flood, placed so calmly at the center of the list, becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a transfer, a moment when the structure of governance remained, but its custodians changed. The throne did not vanish. It waited. When the waters receded, the world did not awaken like a newborn. There was no stumbling, no crude experimentation, no visible learning curve etched into the soil. Instead, something far more unsettling appears in both the ground and the records left behind. Civilization returns fully formed. The earliest post-flood cities do not resemble provisional shelters or tentative settlements. They rise with confidence. Streets intersect at deliberate angles. Canals branch with measured precision. Administrative buildings appear alongside temples. And writing emerges not as a hesitant attempt at communication, but as a mature system capable of abstraction. This absence of childhood is difficult to reconcile with how human societies are expected to develop. Tools usually improve slowly. Systems refine themselves through error. Yet here, at the very point where civilization supposedly restarts, complexity is already present. Writing is the most striking example. When cuneiform appears in the archaeological record, it does not arrive as crude markings gradually evolving toward language. It arrives structured. Hundreds of standardized signs, consistent syntax, immediate use in accounting, law, medicine, and ritual. The tablets do not experiment with writing. They rely on it. This suggests not invention, but recall. The same pattern emerges in mathematics. The earliest numerical systems are not simple tallies. They are based on a sophisticated sexagesimal structure base 60 that allows precise division of time and space, hours, minutes, seconds, angles, circles, celestial cycles. The system is not explained in the texts. It is assumed. No transitional system precedes it. No simple accounting method leaves a trail behind. The numbers behave as though they were always meant to fit together this way. Astronomy deepens the unease. Clay tablets track planetary movements with accuracy that demands centuries of observation. The cycles of Venus are recorded not as discoveries, but as known quantities. The sky is already mapped, the calendar already calibrated, the heavens already ordered. This is not how knowledge normally emerges. It is how knowledge behaves when it is preserved. Law follows the same logic. Early legal codes do not present themselves as new legislation. They present themselves as restorations of justice. Kings speak of re-establishing fairness as it was in ancient days. The authority of the law does not flow from the ruler's will, but from a standard believed to predate him. Medicine, too, appears already systematized. Diagnostic texts describe symptoms, prognoses, and treatments with clinical detachment. Illness is categorized. Causes are inferred. Outcomes are predicted. There is no sense of trial and error. The physician consults established knowledge, not experimental insight. Across every domain, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, the same anomaly appears. The systems do not grow, they resume. The people who inherit this world do not behave like pioneers, they behave like custodians. This is why so many ancient texts speak of learning as remembering. Knowledge is described as something revealed, reopened, or uncovered. The metaphors are not of discovery, but of access. Doors opened, tablets unsealed, foundations exposed. Even education reflects this mindset. Scribes train by copying older tablets, some written in archaic language they no longer fully understand. Accuracy matters more than comprehension. The act of copying is itself an act of preservation, and beneath this practice lies a quiet fear that if the old forms are altered, something essential will be lost forever. This fear explains the obsessive repetition found in architecture. Cities do not drift in design. Temples do not change orientation. Sacred geometry persists across centuries. Each rebuilding effort follows the same plan, aligned with buried predecessors. This is not stagnation, it is fidelity. The builders are not incapable of innovation. They simply do not believe innovation is their role. Their task is to maintain alignment with a pattern they believe is older and wiser than they are. In this worldview, progress does not mean improvement. It means accuracy. To deviate from the inherited form is not creative, is dangerous. This helps explain why the earliest civilizations appear so suddenly advanced. They are not starting from nothing. They are starting from fragments, pieces of a larger system whose full context has already been lost. Imagine inheriting a complex machine without its manual. You know it works. You can keep it running. You can replace parts. But you do not know how it was designed or why certain decisions were made. Over time, you learn to operate it through imitation, not understanding. This is the posture ancient civilization seems to adopt. The flood did not erase knowledge entirely, it fractured it. What survived was systems stripped of their origin stories, maintained through habit rather than explanation. And because these systems worked, there was no incentive to reinvent them. Success reinforced preservation. Thus, civilization after the flood does not look like an experiment in human potential. It looks like the careful continuation of something already complete. This reframes the idea of human genius. The brilliance of early civilization may lie not in its creativity, but in its discipline, in its ability to hold together inherited complexity without fully grasping its source. The absence of developmental stages is not evidence of impossibility. It is evidence of memory. And memory, unlike invention, carries weight. Because memory implies responsibility to the past, to accuracy, to preservation. The people who rebuilt after the flood did not believe they were making history. They believed they were preventing its disappearance. And in that belief, civilization takes on a different character. Less triumphant, more fragile, defined not by confidence, but by care. The world they inhabited was not new. It was remembered. If civilization after the flood feels like a careful reconstruction, then the figures said to have ruled before it occupy an even stranger place in memory. They are not introduced with reverence. They are not surrounded by ritual language or demands for worship. In the earliest texts, they simply appear embedded in administrative records, legal formulations, and practical instructions. These are the Anunnaki. Later traditions would turn them into gods of the underworld, cosmic judges, or distant mythic forces. But in the oldest surviving sources, before centuries of retelling reshaped them, their role is far more grounded, almost uncomfortably so. They allocate, they decree, they measure, they govern. The language used to describe them lacks the texture of devotion. There are no hymns begging for mercy, no prayers asking for miracles. Instead, the Anunnaki are invoked the way a modern document might reference a governing body or supreme authority. Their decisions are binding, their judgments final. In one legal tablet, a mundane dispute over water rights is settled not by divine spectacle, but by appeal to the Anunnaki. The text does not describe them intervening with supernatural force. It records their authority as administrative. The case is resolved because their jurisdiction is recognized. This is not religion as we usually imagine it. It is governance. The Anunnaki appear repeatedly in texts dealing with infrastructure canals, irrigation schedules, agricultural cycles. They are associated with measuring rods, boundary stones, and surveying tools. When they determine fate, the context often involves resource allocation, seasonal timing, or civic order. Fate, in these records, does not mean mystical destiny. It means assignment. Who controls which land? Who maintains which channel? When planting begins? How surplus is stored? The Anunnaki oversee the mechanisms that allow civilization to function without collapsing into chaos. This is why they do not perform miracles. Miracles disrupt systems. The Anunnaki preserve them. Each is associated with a specific domain. One governs fresh water and wisdom. Another oversees fertility and continuity. Another regulates justice and exchange. These are not abstract cosmic roles. They are portfolios, jurisdictions, and together they form a council. In narratives where they appear collectively, the Anunnaki deliberate. They debate. They weigh outcomes. Decisions are made through process, not decree. Even the decision to bring about the flood is framed not as rage, but as administration responding to an unsustainable condition. Humanity's growth becomes noisy, not sinful, not corrupt, simply disruptive. The solution is not annihilation, but reduction. Balance must be restored. The tone is chillingly practical. After the flood, something changes in how the Anunnaki are described. They do not disappear entirely. They withdraw. Their direct involvement ends. Their role shifts from active governance to distant oversight. This transition is never dramatized. There is no battle, no rebellion, no fall from grace. They simply cease to be present, and humanity steps into the vacuum. The kings who follow do not claim equality with the Anunnaki. They do not replace them. They govern under the assumption that a higher order once existed and that their authority is provisional. This explains why the Anunnaki are remembered with such persistence. They are not simply mythic ancestors. They are the source of legitimacy. To say that a law originates with the Anunnaki is to place it beyond debate. To say that a city was assigned by them is to make its boundaries unquestionable. Their memory stabilizes society long after their absence. In this sense, the Anunnaki function less like gods and more like a constitution. They represent an unchanging standard against which human governance is measured. When kings rule justly, they are said to align with the ancient order. When they rule poorly, they are accused of deviating from it. The Anunnaki do not need to return. Their authority remains embedded in systems. This reframes the entire question of who they were. Instead of asking whether they were literal beings or symbolic constructs, the texts invite a different focus. What matters is not their nature, but their role. They are remembered as administrators because administration is what civilization fears losing most. Order, measurement, allocation, continuity. The flood threatened these things. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki endangered them further. Humanity's response was not to innovate new systems, but to cling to the old ones as tightly as possible. This is why ancient texts describe learning as obedience, why deviation is framed as disorder, why knowledge is sacred not because it is mysterious, but because it is fragile. The Anunnaki are not worshipped because they are powerful. They are remembered because they established a way the world was supposed to work. And once that way was set, altering it felt like courting collapse. The unsettling implication is that civilization's foundations were laid under guidance that was not human in origin, whether literal or malignant, that human history unfolds under the shadow of that earlier order. The Anunnaki do not loom as gods demanding reverence. They linger as managers who left the building running and never returned. And humanity, inheriting their systems without their presence, learned to govern by imitation rather than design, which raises a quiet, unsettling possibility, that what we call civilization is not the result of bold creation, but of careful compliance with a blueprint we did not draft. Cities, more than texts, reveal how deeply this belief in inheritance shaped the ancient world. Words can be copied, numbers can be preserved, but cities require continuous, collective commitment. They demand agreement across generations. And yet, When archaeologists began to peel back the layers of the earliest urban centers, what they found was not evolution, but repetition. Beneath the visible streets and temples lie older ones. Beneath those, older still. And at each level, the same choices appear to have been made again and again, as though deviation were not an option. At sites like Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur, temples were rebuilt dozens of times over spans of thousands of years. Fires, floods, and wars destroyed them. Each time, builders cleared the rubble, measured the foundations beneath, and reconstructed the structure according to the same plan. The orientation did not drift. The proportions did not change. The sacred geometry remained fixed. This was not because the builders lacked imagination. It was because they believed imagination had no authority here. In foundation inscriptions, kings speak with remarkable humility. They do not claim to design, they claim to restore. Again and again, the same phrasing appears. I rebuilt it as it was in ancient days. The emphasis is not on novelty, but on fidelity. To build incorrectly was to break alignment with the past. This mindset extended beyond temples into the layout of entire cities. Street grids followed ancient axes. Canals traced paths laid down long before the current population arrived, even when cities were abandoned for generations. Later, inhabitants returned to the same locations, rebuilding atop artificial mounds formed from the accumulated debris of earlier settlements. These mounds, known as tells, are not accidents of history. They are monuments to continuity. Each layer represents a decision not to move on, but to return. Why rebuild on ruins instead of starting fresh elsewhere? The practical reasons, access to water, fertile land, are only part of the answer. The deeper reason lies in belief. These places were chosen once, by an authority no longer present, and that choice was not to be questioned. The city itself became a kind of memory device. Ziggurats make this even clearer. These massive stepped platforms dominate the urban landscape, yet they serve no practical purpose. They are not defensive. They are not residential. Their construction required immense labor and coordination, and yet they offer no material return. Their purpose is alignment. They rise in stages, echoing a cosmological model in which heaven and earth mirror one another. Their corners align with cardinal directions. Their tiers correspond to celestial order. They are architectural translations of a worldview in which the city is meant to reflect a structure that already exists elsewhere. In this sense, ziggurats are not monuments to gods. They are anchors. They fix the city to a pattern believed to be older than human habitation. Each time one is rebuilt, the act reaffirms the belief that the city must remain in alignment with that ancient order, regardless of who currently occupies it. This is why even powerful rulers, commanding vast resources, did not alter these forms. They expanded them, they reinforced them, but they did not redesign them. Change, in this context, was not progress. It was risk. This architectural conservatism reveals something profound about how these societies understood time. The past was not something to be surpassed. It was something to be maintained. The future was not a horizon of possibility, but a responsibility to preserve continuity. This stands in stark contrast to modern assumptions. We expect cities to grow organically, to adapt, to transform. We equate change with vitality. But for the inheritors of this ancient world, stability was the highest value. The city was not a human experiment. It was a sacred inheritance. And inheritance carries rules. You do not redesign an heirloom. You repair it. You keep it functional. You pass it on. The result is a civilization that appears frozen in form even as centuries pass. Styles remain consistent, plans repeat. Innovations, when they occur, are subtle and framed as rediscoveries rather than departures. This helps explain why ancient cities can feel eerily timeless. They do not express the personality of a moment. They express loyalty to an origin. Even destruction did not break this loyalty. When floods buried cities under silt, the rebuilding that followed was not random. Builders excavated down to older foundations, realigned their measurements, and reconstructed upward as though the buried city was still guiding their hands. The earth remembers, even when names are forgotten. This practice suggests that the builders believed the original design possessed an authority they did not. They trusted the past more than themselves. And this trust extended beyond architecture into social order. Just as cities were rebuilt according to ancient plans, societies were governed according to ancient laws. Deviations were seen as sources of disorder, not progress. To live in such a city was to live inside a memory reinforced every day by walls that stood where walls had always stood, by streets that followed ancient paths, by temples that faced the same direction they had faced for millennia. In this environment, history is not something you read about, it is something you inhabit, and perhaps that is why the idea of inheritance was so powerful. It was not an abstract belief. It was built into the ground beneath one's feet. Every brick laid in alignment with an older brick. Every generation walking the same routes. Every ruler stepping into an office defined long before his birth. The city itself whispered the same message the tablets recorded. You are not the first. You are not the designer. You are the caretaker. If cities were built as reminders, the knowledge itself functioned as memory, not inspiration, not discovery. Memory, and the way ancient civilizations handled knowledge reveals this more clearly than any monument ever could. Across mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law, early texts do not present ideas as tentative or experimental. They present them as settled. The tone is never exploratory. It is instructional. The writer does not ask whether a method works. He explains how it is done. This is not the posture of someone inventing something new. It is the posture of someone preserving something old. Mathematical tablets offer problems with exact solutions but no derivations. A rectangle's diagonal is calculated with precision that implies familiarity with relationships. Later formalized as the Pythagorean theorem, compound interest is computed using exponential growth. Fractions are manipulated effortlessly within the base 60 system. Yet nowhere do these texts explain how such methods were discovered. They are simply applied. The scribes did not consider this knowledge fragile because it was complex. They considered it fragile because it was inherited. Astronomy deepens the pattern. Records of planetary movement, especially the cycles of Venus, span decades, even centuries. Such accuracy requires sustained observation across generations. Yet the tablets themselves describe these records as copies of older observations. Marginal notes identify them as according to the old texts. The original observers are unnamed. Their work predates the scribes who preserve it. The sky, in these records, is not being explored. It is being maintained. Calendars align with celestial events, as though the relationships between time, seasons, and stars were already known. The zodiac appears not as a gradual mapping, but as an established framework. The heavens are treated as a system that must be kept in sync with human activity, not a mystery to be unraveled. Medicine follows the same logic. Diagnostic handbooks list symptoms, treatments, and prognoses in methodical detail. Illness is classified. Outcomes are anticipated. The physician's role is not to experiment, but to recognize patterns. Healing is practiced as applied knowledge, not discovery. The language used to describe medical knowledge again points backward. Treatments are attributed to ancient authorities. The art of healing is said to have been revealed, not invented. Even mistakes are framed as failures to apply inherited wisdom correctly, not as gaps in understanding. Law, perhaps more than any other domain, exposes the underlying philosophy. Early legal codes do not justify themselves through royal power. They justify themselves through alignment with an older order. Kings claim to restore justice as it was before. The legitimacy of law rests on its antiquity, not its adaptability. Justice is not something humans decide. It is something they enforce. This belief shapes how knowledge is transmitted. Education is not about creativity, it is about fidelity. Scribes learn by copying older texts verbatim. Accuracy is prized above comprehension. Even when a tablet's language is archaic or obscure, it is preserved. The act of copying becomes a ritual of continuity. Warnings appear at the end of tablets. Let no one alter this. Copied from the old text. These are not decorative phrases. They are protective measures against loss. Loss, in this worldview, is the greatest threat. Because once knowledge is gone, it cannot be recreated. The past possessed understanding that the present does not. That assumption governs everything. This is why innovation is cautious. New ideas are framed as rediscoveries or restorations. Breakthroughs are credited to ancient sources. Even improvements are justified by reference to what was done in former times. Knowledge behaves less like a growing tree and more like a fading image. Each generation works to keep it clear, knowing it will never be fully restored. This is not intellectual stagnation. It is intellectual humility. The inheritors of this world do not assume they are smarter than their predecessors. They assume the opposite. Their task is not to surpass the past, but to preserve what remains of it. This posture explains why civilizations could maintain extraordinary systems without understanding their origins. The system worked, that was enough. Understanding could be deferred, fidelity could not. And so knowledge becomes ritualized. Mathematics becomes formulaic. Astronomy becomes calendrical. Medicine becomes diagnostic. Law becomes codified. Each domain locks into place, stabilized by tradition. The flood, in this light, did not end knowledge. It changed its character. Knowledge before the flood may have been lived. After it, knowledge is remembered. The difference is subtle but decisive. Lived knowledge evolves naturally. Remembered knowledge resists change. This resistance gives ancient civilization its uncanny feel. Everything seems both advanced and static, capable yet constrained, brilliant yet cautious. The people living within this framework did not experience it as limitation. They experienced it as duty. To forget was failure. To alter was danger. To preserve was virtue. And when knowledge is treated this way, history ceases to be a story of progress. It becomes a story of survival of fragments, carried forward through catastrophe, copied by hands that know they are holding something irreplaceable. Civilization, then, is not humanity's bold declaration of independence. It is humanity's long act of remembrance. Once this pattern is seen clearly in Mesopotamia, it becomes difficult to ignore elsewhere. What initially appears unique begins to repeat, quietly but insistently, across cultures that never met, separated by oceans, languages, and millennia. Different names, different symbols, the same structure. An age before humanity governed itself. A catastrophe or transition. A diminished world inherited afterward. In Egypt, king lists do not begin with human pharaohs. They begin earlier. Long before the first dynasties recognized by modern chronology, Egyptian records speak of a time when the gods ruled directly. Their reigns are measured in thousands of years. They are listed with the same administrative care as later human kings. No distinction is made in format. Divine rule and human rule occupy the same historical ledger. After this primordial age comes an intermediate period figures who are neither fully divine nor fully human. The followers of Horus, transitional rulers bridging to worlds. Only after this extended passage does familiar history begin. The structure mirrors the Sumerian account precisely. Authority descends, it withdraws. Humanity inherits. In India, the pattern stretches time itself. Ancient texts describe vast cycles known as Ugas ages of declining order. The earliest age is not described as primitive. It is described as complete. Divine beings are present. Knowledge is direct. Law is inherent in reality itself. With each subsequent age, something recedes. Lifespans shorten. Clarity diminishes. Divine presence fades. Humanity assumes greater responsibility, but under worsening conditions. The current age is not portrayed as progress. It is portrayed as survival in the aftermath of loss. Again, the same logic appears. History moves away from perfection, not toward it. In the Americas, civilizations that developed in isolation tell strikingly similar stories. Mesoamerican traditions speak of previous worlds, each governed by beings who were not fully human. Each world ends in catastrophe. Each time, humanity returns under altered conditions. Teacher figures arrive from the sea or sky. They bring calendars, agriculture, architecture, and law. Then they depart, often promising to return. Their absence is remembered not as liberation, but as abandonment. In East Asia, early chronicles begin with sage rulers who govern for centuries. They are credited not with inventing civilization, but with revealing it. Agriculture, medicine, writing, and ritual are transmitted through them as though they already existed in principle, awaiting application. Across Polynesia, oral histories speak of master builders who preceded known settlement. Stonework too precise to easily explain. Structures attributed to beings who lived before the ancestors arrived. They retreat into myth not because they were unreal, but because they belonged to a time no longer accessible. These stories are not identical. They do not share characters or symbols, but they share architecture. They all remember a world in which governance came from somewhere else. This repetition challenges comfortable explanations. Cultural diffusion cannot account for it. These civilizations developed independently. Psychological archetypes explain some similarities, but not the administrative precision. These are not vague creation myths. They are chronological frameworks. They list rulers. They mark transitions. They track decline. Most importantly, they all place humanity after something greater. This does not mean the ancients believed themselves insignificant. On the contrary, they believed themselves responsible. Responsibility grows when guidance fades. Authority becomes heavier when it is inherited rather than imposed. What unites these traditions is not speculation about beings from the sky or the sea. It is a shared memory structure, a way of organizing the past that treats civilization as a legacy rather than an achievement. The past is not chaotic, it is ordered. The present is not triumphant, it is careful. In this worldview, catastrophe is not the end of the world. It is the end of direct oversight. What follows is maintenance. This is why ancient societies placed such emphasis on ritual repetition, architectural fidelity, and textual preservation. They were not reenacting myths. They were stabilizing a system they believed was already in decline. When modern observers interpret these traditions as symbolic, something essential is missed. Symbols do not behave this consistently across unrelated cultures. Administrative memory does. The ancients did not separate myth, history, and governance the way we do. For them, these were layers of the same structure. A king list could include gods and humans without contradiction. A calendar could align celestial cycles with civic order. A law code could claim divine origin and still function practically. The question was never whether the earlier rulers were literal in a modern sense. The question was whether the order they established was real, and it was. The irrigation canals flowed, the calendars aligned, the laws governed, the cities endured. That was proof enough. If these patterns were preserved independently across the world, then either humanity shares a universal tendency to imagine lost perfection, or these civilizations are remembering something older than their separation. The texts themselves do not choose between these possibilities. They do not argue, they preserve. And preservation, repeated this consistently, across continents and centuries, suggests that whatever was remembered mattered deeply to those who carried it forward, not because it was comforting, but because it explained why the world felt incomplete. After the withdrawal comes the longest chapter of all, not the age of gods, not the moment of catastrophe, but the quiet stretch that follows when humanity is left alone to govern a world it did not design. This is where most of history takes place. In the records that survive, there is no declaration of independence from the earlier order, no celebration of self-rule. Instead, there is a persistent anxiety about legitimacy. Kings do not say, "I rule because I am strong." They say, "I rule because this is how it has always been done." Authority must be anchored somewhere beyond the individual, beyond the present moment, and so it is anchored in the past. Rulers justify their power by appealing to ancient foundations. Laws are enforced because they align with older justice. Cities are governed according to plans believed to be original. Even conquest is framed as restoration, bringing territories back into proper order rather than claiming something new. This reveals a paradox at the heart of inherited governance. Humanity rules, but does not feel sovereign. The systems continue to function. Canals distribute water. Calendars regulate seasons. Courts adjudicate disputes. But the source of these systems is no longer present to explain or adapt them. Humanity must operate them by precedent alone. Over time, this produces a culture obsessed with continuity. Archives grow, libraries are built, tablets are copied and recopied. Knowledge is gathered not to expand it, but to prevent further loss. Even when empires rise, their greatest achievements are framed as acts of recovery. Kings dig into older foundations, literally and metaphorically. They excavate ruins to find original alignments. They search for ancient texts to validate present decisions. One ruler describes his greatest pride not as conquest, but as finding the old foundations and rebuilding upon them. Another boasts not of new laws, but of restoring justice as it was in distant days. This is not nostalgia, it is dependence. The past functions as the ultimate authority. It cannot be challenged because it cannot be fully accessed. Its incompleteness makes it sacred. And yet, something slowly shifts. As generations pass, the memory of the earlier rulers becomes less concrete. Names persist, but contexts fade. The Anunnaki, once described as administrators, gradually become gods. Their practical functions are mythologized. Their decisions are retold as cosmic dramas. This is not deception, it is adaptation. As direct memory dims, symbolism steps in to preserve meaning. The structure remains, but the language changes. Governance becomes theology, administration becomes myth. The withdrawal, then, does not end influence. It transforms it. What was once enforced through presence is now enforced through belief. This transformation stabilizes society, but it also freezes it. Change becomes dangerous. Innovation becomes suspect. Any deviation from ancient patterns risks breaking alignment with an order no one fully understands. This is why periods of collapse are so devastating. When systems fail, there is no blueprint for rebuilding beyond imitation. When imitation falters, confusion spreads. Competing interpretations of the past emerge, each claiming authenticity. Civilizations fracture not because they forget everything, but because they remember differently. Each revival attempts to return to the same source, but the source grows more distant each time. Restoration becomes approximation. This cycle repeats across history. Collapse, recovery, restoration, decline, each time. Humanity reaches backward, grasping for guidance that recedes further into silence. Yet the belief persists that the guidance was once there. That belief shapes behavior even now. Because to see yourself as an inheritor is to act cautiously. It is to preserve rather than disrupt. It is to fear loss more than stagnation. Humanity, in this view, is not progressing toward mastery. It is managing decline. This does not mean ancient people lacked creativity or resilience. They adapted constantly, but adaptation occurred within boundaries defined by the past. Those boundaries were not negotiable. The inherited world functioned, but it did not evolve freely. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of the withdrawal. Not the loss of divine rulers, but the loss of permission to redesign the system itself. From that point on, history becomes a long effort to keep something running without knowing how it was originally built. And every generation feels the weight of that responsibility. Because if the world breaks completely, there will be no earlier age left to restore. As the story draws toward its quietest point, it does not resolve, it loosens. Like a room slowly darkening, details soften, edges blur, and what remains is not an answer, but a feeling. Imagine living in a world you believe was inherited, not built from scratch, not discovered through trial and error, but received already shaped, already ordered, already burdened with memory. Every law you enforce, every calendar you follow, every city you rebuild carries the weight of an origin you cannot reach. In such a world, history is not a ladder climbing upward. It is a shoreline retreating. Each generation walks farther from the water, still guided by its sound, even when the sea itself can no longer be seen. The ancients did not describe themselves as pioneers. They described themselves as caretakers. They measured their success not by innovation, but by fidelity. To live well was to preserve alignment. To govern well was to remember correctly. This belief did not make their world static. It made it careful. Careful with words, careful with structures, careful with time itself. Because when you believe the greatest knowledge belongs to the past, the future becomes something to safeguard, not conquer. Change is approached gently. Authority is borrowed, not claimed. Responsibility outweighs ambition. Whether the Anunnaki were literal beings, symbolic administrators, or the echo of a lost order no longer matters here. What matters is what the belief in them did. It shaped how humanity understood its place in the world. Not as creators standing at the beginning of history, but as heirs standing in its middle. And perhaps that perspective still lingers, quietly, beneath modern assumptions of progress. Perhaps it explains why ruins move us, why ancient maps feel familiar, why we sense that something important lies behind us, just out of reach. If the world was once governed more closely, more deliberately, then living in its aftermath would feel exactly like this: functional, impressive, and incomplete all at once. A system still running, a memory still guiding, a silence where instruction once stood. And as the night settles, the question no longer demands an answer. It simply remains, like a distant horizon, asking us to listen rather than decide. What if we are not the authors of this world, only its custodians?